Hi, this is Aaron from AaronOnAutos.com, and this is a special edition Driving in Wyoming podcast. Today we're going to talk about the Rocky Mountain driving experience, which happened in the second to last week of June. It was specifically on June 18th and 19th. I would have done this podcast last week, but we were out of town on vacation, so I didn't have time to do it. Anyway, this is an annual event held by the Rocky Mountain Automotive Press. It's a chance for journalists like myself to get our hands on a lot of vehicles in a short amount of time. Manufacturers bring everything they have that they think would be of interest, and we drive them on the roads of Colorado, usually in the Denver area, and also on a racetrack the second day. So I will go through fast first impressions of every car that I drove. They won't necessarily be in the order that I drove them, but I will split them by on-road and on the track. Some of the cars will overlap because I drove them both on the road and on the track. I'll just go more or less in alphabetic order by manufacturer. Hyundai was there. They had the 2014 Tucson, which was a great looking car. It's a lot prettier than I remember them looking. I haven't driven, before this I had not driven the Tucson outside of, I believe it was a 2012 was the last one I was in. So this is a very, very nice update. I really enjoyed it. It drives very well. Hyundai is really moving forward with their value for the dollar on these cars, and this is a great vehicle. Next up was a Jeep Cherokee Trailhawk. I'm not a fan of the new Jeep Cherokee look, but I am a big fan of the Trailhawk because I think that look comes together in this package. All together, you know, they add on a few things for that trail off-road stuff, and it really kind of comes together and looks really good on this. Also, it drives very well. We did some light off-road and, light to maybe medium off-road, and this handled it beautifully. I never even put it in four-wheel drive for it. One last thing is the turning radius is extremely sharp. It's a great turning radius. I'm amazed to see it on a vehicle this size. Next up was the 2014 Kia Sorento. Now, I had this for a week as a test loan. This one was in a different color, slightly different package. It was a little bit cheaper in terms of the price tag versus the one that I drove, so this was not the top fitting. And it was nice to see that it still looks good, it still drives well, and the interior is still very well outfitted, even though this is a lower end model. So that was nice to see. I was glad to see that. Next came the Ram 1500. This was the Outdoorsman edition in Eco Diesel. This is the Ram's new V6 Cummins engine. This is amazingly great. This is a half-ton truck. The Ram 1500 has kind of been, for the last 2 or 3 years, a real forward model for Ram. You remember they introduced the V6 with the 8-speed transmission, and that kind of changed the game for everybody, and now suddenly we're seeing, aluminum from Ford and a lot more push for Ecotec from Chevy and so forth. In this edition, it's a very pretty truck. It's beautiful to look at. It drives very well like Ram should. They always drive well on the highway and stuff because of those coil springs in the back. It does pretty well in just down a dirt road. I didn't have time to take it off-road, but I did take it down a dirt road. I spent about 45 minutes in this truck all told, and some of that was, by the way, with one of the competitors, press representatives who was eyeballing this, getting the updates. So very nicely done truck. I should have a full review of that truck soon. They promised to bring it to me for a press loan so I can do a full. Next was the 2014 Range Rover Evoque. This is a beautiful SUV. The Evoque has always been very nice. It's a higher end SUV. It costs a little bit more, but it's a very, very nice vehicle. Had a good time driving it. Had a good friend with me who had already driven it, and we talked about what we saw as differences and so forth. Drove very well, and of course it's aluminum body, so it's very, very lightweight and not top heavy at all, which is unusual for an SUV. Very nicely done. Next was the 2014 Volkswagen Passat Sport. Now, this is the gasoline version. I am not a big fan of Volkswagen's gasoline engines. To me, they just don't feel as good as some other automakers, but the Passat diesel is one of my favorite vehicles ever. So it was kind of nice to get into the gasoline and see what it does. It really doesn't have a lot of low end going on. It takes a long time to really kind of pick up. Putting sport on it, I think, is kind of a more of a sales point than a reality. Then some 2015 models. Drove the 2015 Audi A3, very nice car. It's an entry-level Audi, so it's not quite up to par with what I would think of as Audi. But again, this is a lower-end car. Unusual for Audi to have one at this low price point. It was under 40, if I remember correctly. You know, it drives well for what it is. It needs a little more oomph, I think. To be an Audi, to be that German Audi you expect, it just kind of needs a little more going on under the hood. Next was the 2015 Honda Fit. This was an amazingly surprising car. Normally I look at these shoeboxes with wheels and I think, wow, I can't believe I have to try to get into that. This one drove very well. It drives like you expect a Honda to, which means it has a lot of low-end speed. First 10 miles an hour are pretty exciting. That's kind of how Honda builds their cars. That's the appeal they have. This is a manual transmission, so it was a little more fun to drive. But what amazed me about it is this tiny, tiny car has huge amounts of space on the inside, very comparable to the Nissan Versa Note, which I will do a full review of very soon because I just finished driving it for about a week. And that car has just an amazing amount of interior space and seating, and this car matches it. This segment is very fun to watch, this little subcompact segment, because these cars are getting more and more popular, and auto manufacturers are seeing that they have to really up the game. Next was an interesting one that I didn't even know was going to be there and was glad to see. That was the 2015 Subaru Legacy. This is an all-new Legacy from Subaru. Everything has basically been updated. It's a very good car. I really liked it. You know, signature Subaru smoothness thanks to that Boxer engine, and very nicely done transmission. I believe it's a CVT. I'd have to look at the paperwork, which I don't have right in front of me. It was a very, very nice car to drive, and the price point was good for what you're getting in the package. It was very well done. I'm looking forward to a longer drive of this, probably towards the end of the year. And one of the more exciting ones that everybody was looking forward to, and I certainly wanted to get into, was the 2015 Toyota 4Runner TRD Pro. Now, Toyota's coming out with 3 vehicles in the TRD Pro packaging, which is a new off-road packaging they're doing. There's the 4Runner here. There's also a Tacoma as well as a Tundra. The 4Runner is it's a hit and miss vehicle for Toyota, and in this case, they really hit it well, square on the head. Beautiful driver, goes off-road very well, like the Cherokee Trailhawk I talked about earlier. The 4Runner TRD Pro had no reason to go into four-wheel drive for the medium-duty trail we were on. Drives very well, but on the highway it's a little bit noisy, but you can thank those huge tires for that. And again, this is not going to sell to the commuter. This car is to sell to the person who wants to drive out on the beach or drive over the rocks to get over the mountain or bounce around on a trail out in the middle of nowhere. That's what this is for. And next up was, finally for this, for on the road, was a 2015 Volkswagen Golf TDI. Now, I've never been a big fan of the Golf because I don't normally fit in them, but they have changed everything about this car for 2015. There's a lot of technical details that they changed to improve their manufacturing and costs related to that. But what really changed as far as a first impression getting in the car is the seats are much roomier, the interior is much roomier, the back seat is bigger, the front seat, I have big shoulders, I can sit in it and not be getting close to bumping the person in the passenger seat. It drives very smoothly. The dash has been changed, so it's much more ergonomic. Your infotainment screen faces you a little better. It's easier to get to. The gauges are still good because it's German engineering. They just improved everything that really needed to improve about the Golf and made it so that it's a car that I enjoyed driving. I didn't feel that I was forced into it like I had been in the past. So great vehicle, and I was really glad to see that there. So that was the on-road vehicles. Next up, I'll give you some quick track impressions. These were vehicles that I drove on the racetrack at High Plains Raceway. We did the short loop, which is about 1.28 miles around, has 7 curves in it. Very fun racetrack. We go there every year. This year was the 3rd time I have driven on it. I'm becoming quite familiar with the track, so for me, it's now more about becoming familiar with the car rather than the track. You know, I know where the curves are and know what I can and can't do before I come up to them and that sort of thing. Most importantly, I know where the lane is. I know where the sweet spot getting around this track is. And because of that, this year was probably my favorite year driving on the track, even though we didn't have some of the really hot cars we might have had before. So on to that, let's just jump into it. These are in alphabetic order, again, by manufacturer. There was the 2014 Cadillac XTS V Sport. Now, I took this around the track 6 times. 3 of those loops were with a friend driving, and 3 of them were me driving. My friend that was driving is a better track driver than I am, and he was complaining about the car. He was having a very hard time putting it in a manual and then keeping it in where he wanted it as far as shifting versus what it would do on its own when you just allowed the transmission to do its thing. Now, for the first loop around, which is usually a slow loop, you kind of get familiar with the car. I found that I was probably not going to be able to shift the transmission myself and get what I wanted out of it. So on the second loop, which is normally your hot lap, that's where you try to get the most speed, I let the transmission do its own thing. I left it in automatic and just let it do its own thing. And I found that it's very well tuned. I had no problems with it. I would have preferred to have a little more control about holding the RPM levels, but really I did very well in this car, and I really enjoyed it. It hits the red line at about 5,600 RPM or so, and at that point, all power is gone. And if you have it in automatic, it will never hit that. But if you're trying to manually do it, it will ignore you and shift anyway as soon as it hits that red. So you really have to be very careful about how you shift it if you're going to try it manually. And like I said, for me, I just did much better in it by just letting it shift itself and do its own thing. Also, I had just by comparison, I had the Lexus IS350 F Sport there. That was there to drive. And on the track, really, it was no surprise at all. It did everything I expected just because I had already driven it for a week. And I had already tried to do 0 to 60 times in it and knew what to do with the shifting to make it happen. So, you know, it wasn't really a surprise. So I'm not going to include that car on the list. I just wanted to mention it because it is directly comparable to this Cadillac. Next up was the one that everybody wanted to drive and which I thoroughly enjoyed. I did 6 total loops, 2 different sessions at three loops each in the 2014 Dodge Challenger RT Shaker. This is a big orange beast, and it's so much fun. It's not a big, huge muscle car along the lines of, you know, some of the classic American cars that we might think of that have, you know, they're getting in the 500 and 600 horsepower range now. This is a more contemporary, more nostalgic car, I think is a better way to describe it. It's 375 horsepower. It's not massively, you know, it's not a massive output, but it's a big 5.7 liter V8, outputs 375 horsepower. It doesn't sprint around curves. That's an American muscle car thing. They're normally made for straightaways, but I found this car to be very easy to maneuver around curves because you don't have all that power pushing you forward at hugely unsafe speeds. So, and also on the highway, I forgot to mention this car when I did the highway rundown. On the highway, it drove very, very well. It's really a good cruising car. That's what it's made for, I think. The shaker thing is just kind of a throwback, you know, to suck in the Harley Davidson types or the old schoolers that think that they need that sort of thing to look good. And it does look very pretty. If I were to buy this car, I think I would buy the shaker just because it looks way cooler than the standard Challenger. Sweet spot for this is around 4,800 RPM, and what I found was that if you goose the transmission or goose the pedal, the fuel throttle, had to spit that out. If you goose the throttle right before the apex of the curve rather than on the apex of that curve, the rear end will slide around a little bit, and it will make that turn much, much easier and smoother. By the 3rd lap, or by the 5th and the 6th lap in this car, I should say, I was flying around the corners and hitting the straightaways and never once touched the brakes until I pulled into the pits at the end. Beautifully done. Really fun car. I had a good time in it. Had a 6-speed manual transmission, by the way. I had so much fun in this car that I jumped out, grabbed the Chrysler representative, Wendy. Her name is Wendy Orthman. Just grabbed her in a giant bear hug and said, "That was so awesome." It was just a great time. Next up is a Ford, 2014 Ford Fiesta ST. Now, I drove the Focus ST on the track last year and really didn't like it that much. It's a fun track car if you fit in it, and I don't fit in it. I had a tough time driving that car. It was hard to shift. It was a manual transmission. It was hard to shift because it's so short. You know, with the helmet on, I was bending over and cockeyed sideways and trying to drive the car, and I did not fit in the seats at all. Now, the Fiesta was totally different. It's a smaller car, yes, but I fit in it. I was able to sit up almost totally straight with the helmet on, and the seats were not nearly as cramped. I had a great time in this car. It turns corners like a dream, which is unusual for a Ford. You know, normally a Ford will dog around those corners, and you really have to work it. This one does not. It has some understeer, of course, because it's front-wheel drive, but nothing like what you would expect. Drives much better than I expected. And with only 197 horsepower for such a tiny little car, though, you know, it sounds like only 197, but when you look at the size of the car, that's a huge amount of power for such a tiny little car. I had a great time in this. 202 pound-feet of torque. That is where it was at on the track. You shift it down and you get in that sweet spot for the torque, and you can glide every corner on the track. It was beautifully done. Really had a good time in that car. Another one I really enjoyed. I'd driven it on the highway a little bit, and again, I forgot to mention it, of course. I'd driven it on the highway a little bit and got a feel for the new steer-by-wire steering, and on the track, the 2014 Infiniti Q50 sedan. Now, I'm looking forward to a longer test drive in this car very soon, I think. But on the track, it was a real learning experience. I learned a lot by driving this car. Because it steers by wire, it's immediate response rather than having a little bit of lag and some slop in the steering. Every time you touch the steering wheel, something happens. So it was a big learning experience and lots of fun because of that. Maybe it wasn't the fastest car out there. I don't know. I don't think it was. Maybe it wasn't the most sporty or the best whatever, but it was tons of fun because I learned a lot by driving the car, and that means a lot to me. I had a good time in it. Next was the 2014 Kia K900. This is another car I'm looking forward to a longer test drive in. It's a luxury car from Kia, which is odd. Up to now, I've been really skeptical about whether or not they can do that. And now that I've driven it, now that I've seen it in person, it's a stunning car. Very pretty. And the inside is more luxurious than I really expected Kia to be capable of. It's just a great, great car. Very, very nice. On the racetrack, it's just another sedan, honestly. It really wasn't that special. It was a nice car, but it's really not a track car. I don't know why they had it on the track other than they just wanted more exposure for it, I think. I already mentioned the Lexus IS350 F Sport. On the track, it did everything, like I said, everything I expected. It corners beautifully because it's all-wheel drive. It has a lot of get up and go out of that 3.7. It has a little more body roll than the Cadillac did, but it makes up for that with that all-wheel drive. Had some of my best track times. Outside of the Challenger, this car had my best track times, which is surprising because the next car was the one I really expected to be burning rubber in. And that was the 2014 Mercedes-Benz CLA 45 AMG. I drove this car twice. The first 3 laps were in the warm-up at the beginning of the afternoon driving, so it was slower because we're all in a line trying to just, after lunch, getting used to the track again. And then I did it in hot laps. Because I'd already done the warm-up, I did all 3 of my laps as hot laps rather than doing a warm-up lap. Well, 2 of the 3. The last one is a cool-down lap. But anyway, it has a tiny little 2-liter 4-cylinder engine, but it produces 355 horsepower out of that. That's amazing. This is a very, very custom engine. If anything goes wrong with it, they have to literally go to Germany and get another one because they are specifically made for the car. It's very well tuned. The transmission it's attached to is very well done. I was shifting it manually, and in the short laps, the slow cruising laps, I wasn't shifting outside of the last lap just to get used to it. And then when I drove it, I shifted it myself because I just found that I could hold better RPM ranges with that. Really, it's kind of it lacks a little bit of power because it's only a 4-cylinder. I really expected a little more out of it, with those high numbers, and, that 355 horsepower is amazing, but it really didn't have huge amounts of muscle. I expected a little more out of it in terms of get up and go, but really it drove very, very well. If you hold the power band, it will do very well. And it's an AMG, and AMG, if anybody knows how to make a sports car, it's Merc's AMG arm. So beautifully done. Next up, 2014 Mazda 3. Now, you remember I drove this on the road for about a week. I really enjoyed the car. This is a car that I would actually go out and buy because it's a right fit for my family and what we need and my driving style. On the track, it was what I expected it to be. It's not a track car, but it drives well. It does well on the track because of that Skyactiv chassis and build. It's a 2.5 liter. For a car this size, that's a good size engine. Again, it's not going to win any races, but it was fun on the track. It was nice to try it and put it through some real extreme driving that you would probably never do if you actually own the car. Next was the 2014 Nissan Altima, and honestly, I really like the Altima. It's one of my favorite midsize sedans, but it's not a track car, and it just felt kind of like a waste of time to have it on the track. It was comfortable and it's nice, but it's not a track car. It just wasn't, it wasn't fun. Next, though, from Nissan was the Juke Nismo. Now, this is the 2014 Juke Nismo. You'll remember I did a full review of the 2013. In the interim between those, not much has changed. This is basically the same. They stiffened it a little bit. They've improved the chassis a little bit. But really what changed it for me on the racetrack, because I drove it last year on the racetrack as well, what really changed on the racetrack was that this year, instead of a CVT, this one was the manual transmission, and that makes it way more drivable on the track. I did 6 laps in this, and the retuned suspension and that 6-speed transmission just make it fun to drive on the track. You're not going to win any races, I don't think, because it's still a crossover, so it's not really a track car. I'm convinced that these are really rally cars. But on the other hand, it was fun, and that really meant something. Finally, I've got 2 of them. Okay, sorry. The 2014 Range Rover Sport was next, and it's a Range Rover and it's a sport and it's fun, but somebody else was driving it. I wasn't allowed to drive it. They had a factory driver there to drive it instead, and that's probably because it's a big top-heavy SUV, and even sitting in the passenger seat, I could feel that. And if this thing wrecked, that's a lot of money out the window, and journalists are not good. They're not known to be great drivers, so I don't fault Range Rover for having a driver instead of letting us drive it. It was fun to ride in, and it handled better than I expected an SUV to do, but still it's a sport utility on the track. So top heavy, it doesn't corner well. That's just what you expect. I would have loved to have taken this out on a dirt track somewhere. Finally is the 2015 Volkswagen GTI. This was the only 15 on the track. Most manufacturers, they have limited numbers available, and they really don't want to kill them putting them on a racetrack. So the 2015 Volkswagen GTI. Now, of course, this is a gas engine car, but this is known as a track car. This is a car that people buy and then tune up and do things to and take out to the racetrack. And all of that shows. It's exceedingly lightweight. Just over 3,000 pounds, has very roomy inside, and that 2-liter turbo spits out 210 horsepower, 207 pound-feet of torque. It just dreams around corners thanks to that low stance and that small wheelbase, and it's a heavy front end, so understeer is very well controlled because it's a German car. I had a great time just flipping hard angles in this car. To achieve the corners, you don't glide around the corner, you flip around the corner. It's much easier in this car because of its weight and the way and the handling that it has. It's just very fun to drive. I had a great time in this car. Is it the best car on the track? No, but in this class of car, yes. And also I had the advantage of I have a friend who is exceedingly familiar with these cars and driving them on a racetrack. And she took me around in this car for a couple of loops before I drove it, so I could watch how she handled it. And I learned a lot about how to control this car from watching her rather than learning it on my own and, trial and error. So that gave me a big advantage in this car. Had a good time in it. So there you go. That was the Rocky Mountain driving experience this year. It was tons of fun. Had a really good time. Always do, of course. But got to mingle with a lot of automotive representatives. Got to talk to a lot of people that I otherwise probably wouldn't have talked to. And got to sit in some cars that I will maybe never ever see again because of what they are. Specifically that Mercedes. Great time. Lots of fun. It was 2 days very well spent, I think. And so there you go. That's what I did for that 2 days, and those are the vehicles that I drove. I may have left one or two out, but I think I got to everything. So that was this year's Rocky Mountain driving experience from the Rocky Mountain Automotive Press. So for AaronOnAutos.com, this has been Aaron, and I'll talk to you again soon.